Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Textile Talk. My name is Lucy Shaken. I'm SAQA's Communications Coordinator, and I am your Textile Talks organizer. Textile Talks are presented by the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, or SAQA, and Surface Design Association. We love bringing you these free programs every week, thanks to the support of our sponsors and contributions from viewers like you. If you enjoy Textile Talks, please consider making a donation at SAQA.com/TT support. A few Zoom notes before we begin. This is a webinar, so we cannot see or hear you, but we can read your comments in the chat. We've enabled Zoom's closed captioning feature for this program. You should be able to turn captions on or off by finding the CC or Live Captions button. And if you're on a mobile device, you might find that in your settings instead. Please put any questions you have today in the Q&A box. And if you have suggestions for ways we can improve or for topics that you'd like to see in future Textile Talks, please let us know in the post-event survey. I'd like to take a quick moment and tell you a little bit about SAQA. SAQA is an international membership organization with about 4,300 members. Our mission is to promote the art quilt. We're a welcoming community of artists, curators, collectors, and anyone who loves art quilts and fiber art. Viewers of Textile Talks can get $20 off the first year of a new membership with code TALKS. That's TALKS. You can learn more about membership and join us at SAQA.com/join. The project we'll be discussing today is an animated quilt that Greg Climer created in 2021. It went semi-viral at the time, and I just thought it was so cool. So when I saw that he had applied to last year's open call for Textile Talk speakers, I was like just totally stoked, and we had to have him. So I'm very excited that he's here today, and I want to let you all know that we are currently accepting applications for speakers for our 2025 season. Hi, Greg. So if you have a cool project to share or a story to tell, please do submit. We'd love to hear from you. The deadline is August 31st, and you can find that information at SAQA.com/calls. So now, sorry about that, I'm very pleased to introduce Greg Climer. Greg is an artist who lives and works in San Francisco, California. His textile work has been shown in a number of museums, including the Museum of Art and Design in New York City. He currently serves on the board of directors at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Greg is also a fashion designer and is currently the chair of the fashion program at the California College of the Arts. He received his MFA in Design and Technology from Parsons School of Design. I'm so excited that we're sharing Greg's work with you all today. And Greg, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. So thank you so much for coming today. It's kind of overwhelming to see the number of people in the Zoom. I'm really overwhelmed. I'm very humbled that so many of you took the time to be here. I want to say thank you to the Textile Talks team, to SAQA, the International Quilt Museum, the Quilt Alliance, and the Surface Design Association, as well as Lucy and Martha and the whole team. Y'all have been so incredible to work with. So I was asked to speak about this piece that I finished a few years ago. It's an animated film loop that's composed from it's composed from 36 quilts. I made 36 individual quilts, which were then used as frames and the animation that you're seeing. Like Lucy said, it started to go viral online. It then got shown at the Atlanta Contemporary last year. And so a lot of people just started reaching out to me asking to walk through the process of how I made it. The piece itself, it's a result of a really long journey, and that's what I want to focus on with today's conversation. In order to explain how I made the piece, I want to explain the journey that got me to the piece, and that starts back in grad school at Parsons School of Design. So let's rewind all the way back 15 years ago, when I was in grad school. I would propose these preposterous projects all the time. A few of which I did do was We barricaded Magnolia Bakery in with their own trash one day. I made a dress that had a movie projector built into it. I made a Tom of Finland pop-up book. There were a bunch of amazing ideas that never got made. One was I wanted to make a movie that was only close-ups of the actors' faces. I wanted to put a pinball machine in a dress so that the only way you could play pinball was by dancing. One of my teachers really wanted me to start a cult for some reason. And so from the sound of it, you can tell that our design classes were really pie in the sky. Anything was acceptable. And one of the hallmarks of that program and of my own way of working was to do the work and then figure out why you did the work. Um, the logic behind this do anything approach to a studio was that we figure things out when we're doing them. If we're just sitting and imagining what might be, we leave out all the details and we don't even realize we're leaving them out. But if you start doing it, you're making decisions, you're learning from that experience, and the ideas are evolving. And so this remains one of the best lessons I ever learned as an artist or a designer, which is just do anything. Do anything. You don't need to understand your motivation. Therapists are really great for that. Artists are not. So you just need to constantly stay in motion. And the quilted animation project, which I'm sharing with everyone, is an example of how that motion really pays off. So that big pie in the sky idea, which eventually led to this piece, was I had the idea to knit a film. A faculty mentor who has since become a good friend of mine, he really latched onto the idea and he insisted that I do it. In the knitted film, it was what I always call an impossible project. It was this really fun idea, and I had no clue how to create it. I don't know how to knit. Um, at the time, I didn't seriously begin exploring how to do it, but that idea just was stuck in my brain because my professor kept bringing it up. However, I got thinking about knitting, and that got me thinking about textiles and image making through pixels. And I'd learned to sew as a child and to quilt, and I learned to quilt when I was an undergrad. So quilt making was something that I did, but I never really did it seriously. Like I said, I'm not a knitter, but I'm a quilter. So this interest in pixels, it fit really nicely into the idea of quilts. I could begin to build images, and I was using images from Super Mario Brothers as a launching pad. I've lost these pieces, but this is an example of what an 8-bit Mario is for those of you who don't remember. It's the idea of using blocks of color to create simple images. I grew up playing Nintendo, so this made a lot of sense to me. Um, I stuck with pixelated quilting, not thinking about it, not thinking about its link to knitting at all, but evolved the quilting technique to go really far beyond Mario. I was doing entire photographs in cut squares, and I discovered that my quilts looked a lot more dynamic when I would use multiple grids instead of one grid. Um, I kept experimenting with the size of the squares. I got really technically into the exploration. So the quilts were becoming really refined as images. While this pixel exploration was going on, I have also started taking the knit film seriously again. I couldn't get Ted's insistence out of my head. He brought it up every time, every once in a while. He would say, the knitted film was a really good idea. Um, And I work in fashion design. So I have a lot of friends and a lot of friends of friends with connections to factories. I don't personally know these people, but my network did. So I started asking around. Maybe if I talked to a knitting factory, I would find out that it was impossible and I would just drop the idea. Most of the places I contacted would laugh at me. They really wanted nothing to do with me, saying they made clothing, this idea was foolish. However, the more I talked to them and the more I learned what questions to ask, what machines could do that technique. And through all these rejections, I started picking up information. And so finally, my friend Janine introduced me to a factory owner in New Jersey who just lit up when I told him what I wanted to talk about. And he insisted I come out to his factory. Um, Andy, that factory owner, he said, "This is the most insane thing anybody has ever asked us to make. I have this incredibly intelligent team. They're incredibly talented, and they are wasting their skills making sweaters for Bloomingdale's. I want to do this with you." So we sat and talked about the logistics of how his knitting machines work, how to translate film or images into data that made sense to his machines. And he just gave me marching orders of what I needed to do to prepare computer files for his technicians so that we could do this together. And so suddenly I set out to be a filmmaker. Um, and I realized I had no idea what I wanted to film. I just kept saying I was going to knit a film. I never thought about what I would actually make a film of. I'd been so focused on that medium, I forgot to think about the message. But his instructions on what would work within that medium, they gave me guidelines to practice with. Um, I knew I needed a clean background. I needed high contrast. I needed a close-up if I wanted the person to be recognizable as who they were. Um, the low pixel count meant less details, and I really understood that well because I'd been pixelating fabric into quilts for quite a while. So as I would walk around work that week, I would just stop coworkers and I would say, "Do something for the camera." And they would dance or they would wave their arms or whatever. And I fell in love with this footage of my friend Andrew Robinson on the left. Between the laughing and the dancing, I just felt like I'd captured his personality in about 10 seconds. So I decided to use that for my film. Um, he completely forgot that I had done this by the time I finished. So I took this footage to Andy at the factory, and then he got really involved, altering them and tweaking them because he brought this expertise of the medium that I didn't have. Um, these are some of the layouts for the knitting machines before and after, where we were trying out different colored yarns and figuring out how to work with the data we had in the film. Um, and I did not have any money to fund this. That was the next realization. So Andy was so excited about the project, he was willing to work at a discounted rate, but I still had to pay for yarn. I had to pay his technicians for their time. So I turned to the quilts I'd been making and I started applying for grants for the film, for the knitted film. So back to the quilting. Um, I continued to make quilts, and all the quilts I was making were kind of queer erotic imagery. I was also continuing to talk about this work in a really technical term. I was pounding the pavement. I was showing anyone and everyone. I was hoping to find galleries or some sort of audience. And I was still trying all of these technical variations, really exploring technique, but the content was consistently the same. And in retrospect, this is really because I didn't have words to explain what I was doing. It was intuitive, but it wasn't completely clear to me. When I was in grad school, that lesson of do the work and then figure out why you did the work. I was dodging that second part by always talking about the technique of my work. Technique was something which I knew how to talk about. I knew there was a right and a wrong in technique. There was a clarity which just isn't present in motivation or concept. So I wasn't really able to verbalize why I was so insistent on these quilts being of male nudes. I mean, the obvious reason is I'm a gay man, but that wasn't really reason enough. I have a million interests in this world, and I kept coming back to this one over and over in the quilts. Um, But lucky for me, I had some success in my grant writing. And I think that grant writing success was because I was able to show technical development in the quilting. And so it led authority to this experiment in knitting. People, they saw the quilts and they said, "Oh, he's really good at this. It's technically difficult, but he's good at it. So let's trust him to take a risk on this other technically difficult project." People want to fund safe risks, which is an oxymoron. But that's what I was proving I was. I was someone that was safe to take a risk on. So I had enough success in grant writing that I was able to hire not only Andy's factory to work for me, but also a stop motion animator to help me photograph every frame. And after about 5 years, I finished the knit film. Um, Andrew was ecstatic when he saw it. That silly moment had turned into this object that was substantial in size, and it was just a joyful film. Um, and I showed it at the Brooklyn Open Studios, which is an annual event in New York, where Andrew had his studio. And he invited his entire network to come see my work. And now, because of the open studios, I ended up getting acknowledged in Hyperallergic Magazine, which is a New York City art magazine, as the artist to watch of 2016. And so now I had this real excitement for animation. I'd done this piece, it was huge. And I thought, I bet I could do the same thing with quilts. They're pixels. I'd been thinking of quilting with pixels as this tangent to knitting with pixels, and I hadn't really conceptualized them as linked until that moment where it just dawned on me I could do this with quilts. And so I applied for a residency at the Museum of Art and Design. It was my first time I'd ever applied to be an artist in residence somewhere. In my naivety, I went straight to the best design museum in the country, and they accepted me. Um, they saw I could knit a film and that I could pixelate quilts. So they took a risk on a project, which was to switch those things to animate a quilt. Again, I was a safe risk on a seemingly impossible project. So I ended up, while I was there, I made this animation. It's a man running. It's me running past British phone booths. The phone booths and the running were kind of a riff on the movie Run Lola Run. And I'll admit, it's not a great piece. It's hard to see. The movement's kind of clunky. Um, the piece was a huge learning experience. The feedback was positive, but the image in the piece was muddy and was kind of pointless. If you zone out a bit, the man actually runs backwards because I was still kind of learning how to animate. Um, and I'd made this man running because that's just kind of an animation trope. A walk cycle is what they call it. It's an early animation project that you do as you learn to master animation techniques. And I was using technique as a path forward because I still had no words for why I was doing what I was doing. Um, so consequently, when I finished the Running Man quilt, he felt kind of pointless. Yeah, I had learned a lot, but he just ran in place forever, um, and not even clearly. So the pointlessness of it, it really stuck with me because I was also starting to understand why I was so focused so heavily on making quilts that were queer images. So for me, the queer images were about survival and representation, equality. They were about claiming space. Being gay is such an integral part of my life that I didn't understand wanting to be an artist who happened to be gay. I was a gay artist. Um, and there still is this mainstream stance that it's fine to be gay as long as you keep it to yourself or as long as you fit in with everyone else. And my reaction to that is keep what to myself? Being gay is not only about who I love, which that is a huge part of it, but to me, it's also daily reminders from society that I'm somehow wrong or don't fit here. I am frequently the topic of religious sermons in this country. I'm the topic of laws about protecting minors, as if I have any ill intention towards minors. Um, my existence is such a problem that in some countries it's punishable by death, and in some families in this country, it's a reason to disown your child. So for me, being gay it is about who you love, but it's also about a daily reminder that society thinks I'm less than you. So subconsciously, I'm putting that front and center in reaction to being told that my existence is a sin. I'm making my existence into fine art. My existence is worth going into museums. My existence is worth decorating your home with. My existence is really important. Um, so I saw that aspect of minimizing my identity as just unacceptable. I'd been forged into the man I am because I have had slurs yelled at me, because I have had beer bottles thrown at me. I did have school bullies. Being gay was so integral to making me into a thoughtful, empathetic man, um, that I didn't want it to be reduced to an asterisk when my art was discussed. That's not to say that all my work needed to be explicitly queer, but I did want to leave it present in all my work. And so with this simple realization, I finally understood why I kept making these quilts over and over of male nudes. By this point, I was doing lots of quilts which were pulling really heavily from images from pornography. It was really heavy-handed for sure. But I wanted to do things that were explicitly gay, so I went to explicitly gay imagery. But there was something going on with the work as I did it that it took me a while to recognize. Um, the work had a softness. The overwhelming majority of the pieces were loving, they were soft, they were intimate. And this was a revelation to me, and I was the one doing the work. But again, it goes back to that idea of keep doing the work and learn from the doing. So now I had, with that revelation, as well as all these technical lessons from the two animation projects, I suddenly had all the ingredients for this animated quilt. I guess not suddenly, but slowly. Um, we'd reached this point where I knew how to animate with textiles. I knew some things that really didn't work from that first animation. I knew some things that really did work from the quilts I'd been making. And I knew I wanted it to be a piece that was loving and intimate. I knew that it needed to include my friends. That was something that I learned from the knitting piece with Andrew, that sense of joy and sharing that with someone. Um, I had the technique mostly figured out, and I kind of figured I could wing it for the rest of the technique because at this point I'd had a really high success rate of just winging it. Um, so a friend of mine that I'd met during my residency at the Museum of Art and Design was moving from New York City to LA, and he and his partner threw a going away party. And I asked if I could film a short loop of them kissing each other on the cheek during the party, and they agreed. So at some point that evening, I sat them down on the couch and I filmed them kissing back and forth for a few minutes. I needed one single loop where their hands and their bodies returned to the starting positions so I could loop it seamlessly. Um, Within 100 kisses or so, I found one set of kisses that were right, and I cropped those frames, and then I set, which is what you're seeing now. This is those 36 that worked to form a loop. And I set about using them as my roadmap for the quilts. Like with the knits, I'd captured this fleeting moment of joy with a friend, or in this case, with two friends. It had intimacy without being explicit. It was checking all the boxes of what I had learned, and now I was applying. So I started doing layouts for the piece. And to do this, I go into Photoshop and I break the film into frames. And then I pixelate each frame in Photoshop at the same scale. The Running Man cycle was about 16 quilts. I pieced them all myself, while an incredible artist did the quilt top stitching for me. Um, they were smaller than these quilts would be. These turned out to be about 48 by 36 inches. And this new set was going to be 36 quilts because I knew I needed more frames to get a smoother animation. So I was rightfully nervous about doing all these layouts. I knew that by the time I finished, I would have forgotten so many of the thoughts that led to my decisions, and I'm a terrible note taker. Um, so as a test, I did a single quilt, and I decided that the technique I'd been using of various angles within one piece was going to be too difficult to manage over 36 pieces. Um, I also hated the background. It had that muddy quality again. So I learned from the Running Man, animation that the background needed to be in really strong contrast to the main characters. I knew from the other quilts that organic backgrounds, like light coming through trees or clouds in a sky, they're far more interesting when they're represented in squares of fabric than plain walls and interior spaces. Nature pixelates, so no two pieces are identical. You might have a dozen greens to create the canopy of a tree, while a white wall in an apartment is the same white square over and over again. That one lesson I learned from pixelating quilts is also that having more squares means mistakes become less important. No one notices if a square is too bright when there are 2,000 squares. No one notices if the corners don't line up perfectly. So I cropped out the background of each frame and I replaced it with a nature scene. The green foliage, it's in stark contrast to the red plaid shirt Nathan has and the pink that Brian has on. I made several digital mock-ups. These were to test colors and backgrounds and size of squares. And this is the only one which survives, because usually when they didn't work, I would just delete them. So this is also part of the digital representation of the piece I ended up making. These 36 digital images are now roadmaps for layouts. It's essentially paint by number, but with fabric. Every square on the screen was matched to a square of fabric in real life. I worked with an online print-on-demand fabric company to get the exact colors that I needed in my fabrics. And I estimated it would take me about a month or two to sew each quilt. This meant 3 to 6 years of sewing nothing but these quilts. There was no way I was going to do this alone. I had to hire help. I had to get an assistant. So I reached out to a friend of mine who owns a small tailoring shop in Pakistan. He employs about 6 tailors. Um, he said his team would be open to taking on the work. Um, Basically, for a few months, they would just do different patchworks and send them to me so we could look at the sewing style and the quality of the batting and the backing they were using. And it was a slow back and forth that probably would have taken 10 minutes in person, but that's okay. So we did a series of these until I was really confident in them, and they were confident they knew what I was looking for. And I eventually ended up securing a grant that allowed me to hire a Mars sewing team. I would do the layouts in New York because that's when all the decisions were being made. And then they would piece and quilt them. So I used my digital layouts as maps to do layouts of the 36 quilts. I would then roll up my layouts that I'd done and I would mail them to Pakistan. And it was about 2 or 3 months later, they started arriving in the mail, pieced and quilted. Um, the difference between a full-time machinist sewing 40 hours a week and an artist who sews in the evenings or weekends is just staggering. Um, it would have taken me years and it only took them a few months. So I cropped and bound all of them. They sent them without having cut them down. They left the edges raw for me. And during the COVID lockdown, I cropped and bound them all. I didn't worry as much as I thought I would about every quilt being the exact same size. I realized that these small variations in width or length might actually add some visual appeal to the piece. So a friend and I, we photographed them once people were allowed in each other's apartments. Um, and we closed up all the windows with blackout curtains and we set up lighting equipment. And this was so that the lighting would be the same regardless of how long it took us. And we laid each quilt down on the floor for a photograph. You can see our socks in the corner. And we photographed them from above. At this point, I took those images in Photoshop and I lined them all up. And Photoshop has an animation function. Um, and so there it is. Voila. I made an animation with quilts. I'm going to zip back to this. This is the 36 quilts all lined up one at a time. These were the 36 photos we ended up taking. And then after creating this, I ended up cropping it because whenever it was shown, I wanted it to be shown with the quilts. So having my feet and the blanket and the carpet and stuff in the background didn't make as much sense as showing it like this. Showing it like this made it a little bit more focused, and it allowed the objects that were sitting in the with it in the gallery to represent the quilts themselves. So again, voila, again, now I had a better version of it. Um, so I've been thinking a lot about this project and why it happened. One person who I respected as a teacher and a friend was able to see this kernel of a brilliant idea when I said I want to knit a film. And he like me, he just enjoyed a sense of wonder, and he, like me, enjoyed a ridiculous, oversized, impossible idea. And his excitement for the idea was infectious. Um, this incremental process of going from the 8-bit images to the animated quilt was one that took trial and error. It took listening to my collaborators. It took being willing to really follow tangents. And it happened, one of the things that happened is that I learned that these tangents are not distractions, but they're a really critical part of any journey. Um, So letting go of practicality has been a really critical part of my work. Embracing that sense of wonder has been a critical part of my work. I delight in seeing something new, of being baffled as to how something was made. Um, for so many of us, our sense of curiosity and wonder, it's just been taken out of us. Daydreaming is cut short by scrolling on phones. Designers were all told to solve problems. Um, we needing to pay rent and bills has forced us to be practical in life. So, I mean, we are in really difficult times, and curiosity can seem frivolous. It can seem like a silly pursuit. We're encouraged to monetize hobbies. We're encouraged to focus on growth and turning hobbies into side hustles. And unfortunately, all of that has a side effect of silencing curiosity, of asking what if. It's often met with that's a distraction, or I'm too busy to pursue that idea. I need to be efficient. Um, so just as curiosity has been silenced in so many of us by the situations we're in, it can also be reignited just by adjusting our situation. So how do we reignite curiosity for impossible projects? My first suggestion is get off social media. I constantly am asking, why do any of us care what strangers think? Or why do I care what the friends of my friends think? Or friends who I never see? Um, their hitting like is really inconsequential. My wittiest, funnest thoughts, they're shared over dinner and with friends at happy hour. They're not shared on Facebook or Twitter. Um, that's a distraction that keeps me from being curious. It keeps me scrolling. My second suggestion is to make inspiration into a project. When my best friend and his partner moved to New York, they proposed that every weekend we do something free that we hadn't done before. It was a challenge built out of a desire to see New York City while on a budget of two people who had just moved across the world. um, it was a parameter that forced us to look beyond what we knew. So for about 3 years, we would go to museums and art galleries once or twice a month. We would find performances to attend that were free. We flooded our lives with ideas and experiences which we had no idea about before we created the Free New York Challenge for ourselves. Like, for example, did you know there's a sound art piece in the middle of Times Square? One of the noisiest streets in the country has an art installation underneath a street grate for anyone who knows to stand there and listen. And I only know this because we made a game out of finding fun and inspiration in the city. So these experiences, they reinforce that notion that life is better when there's wonder, and that crazy ideas are entirely possible. Um, you can put a sound art piece in Times Square if you try. When you fill your life with magic, it starts to multiply. The cynical voices in us, they're quieted. there's this push-pull balance between the grind of life and finding joy in life. Um, you can find balance between the two. So make space for stupid ideas that are going to fail spectacularly, and then surprisingly, they might not. um, yeah, so the next thing I think about is I think about this a lot as a teacher. I sometimes joke that I'm paid to just sit there and say yes to everything. A student will say, should I do X or Y? And I'll say, yes. Um, Curiosity leads to creativity. It creates a feedback loop which perpetuates itself. When you're curious, you're filled up with inspiration, and this inspiration starts to percolate and form new ideas. And now these ideas need curiosity to sort out how to do them. So it creates a loop. What I've learned through my journey is that not knowing how can be an excuse to not try, which is fear, or it can also be an engine of exploration. Just do the work and figure it out as you go. Um, it's too hard, is how we trick ourselves into not trying. We've been conditioned to not try things that are super hard. Um, it's socially acceptable to not take too much risk. So we've been conditioned to believe failure is a problem, or that seam rippers are not part of paths moving forward, but they are. This is how we make stuff. Nature is a really winding path. Rivers meander and flow. It's the side paths where communities of fish will flourish. We're the same. We're part of nature. So those rules, they apply to us, um, even if we are living our lives on screens or building things out of plastic. We absolutely have to make space for those weird journeys and trust that our choices will lead us to the right places. And one of my biggest takeaways from writing this and preparing for this was to think about the dozens of people along the way who said yes to every idea I had. One aspect of this journey, which I find really fascinating in retrospect, is how I never gave up on the big idea. I proposed it. I was delighted in how preposterous it was. I don't think I didn't think it would actually succeed so many times while I was working. After I made the Running Man quilt, I thought, well, this is kind of dumb. That was a lot of effort and doesn't look very good. But I also accomplished so many things along the way, which I'm really proud of. And had I stopped there and pivoted to another project, I probably would have been really happy. Um, but I tried to knit a film, and I did. And then I went one step further and I quilted one. And accidentally, along the way, I developed a whole body of work, which I'm incredibly proud of. Um, so somewhere along this journey, I also stopped thinking about the projects I do as impossible. I think of them as ridiculous and preposterous, but they're not impossible. Um, so yeah, so we need more preposterous projects. We need more wonder-filled projects. We do need the impossible projects. So I hope my journey, it nudges all of you to create more art that's ridiculous and delightful and over the top. And I'm going to stop talking and start listening. So thank you all for listening, but let's open up the conversation. Let's open up the room to questions and dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. This has just been so fantastic, and I love this project. And so much of what you said has just really resonated with me as an artist, and I know from their comments it's resonated with a lot of our audience members. It makes me think of one of my favorite pieces of art advice that I've seen from a SAQA member, which is if you're not sure what to do, do more. And if you don't know whether you should do it one way or another way, do it both ways. And I just love that exploring mindset, especially when it comes to art making. And there are so many great comments in the chat, which I will send to you afterwards. And we
I'm
do
just
have,
now seeing them. Of course, I couldn't read and talk at the same time.
of
So,
course, yeah, and we do have
oh,
lots of
thank you,
questions.
everyone.
So I'll start with some of the technical questions.
Okay.
They would like to know how many squares are in each piece, how big are the squares, and how did you lay the squares out?
Um, I don't know how many are in each piece. I can quickly do the math though. If I can find the calculator on my phone because I can't do math and talk. So it's about 1,700 squares in each of the quilts for the animation piece. Um, and they were about an inch. They might have been a little bit smaller. They might have been like 3/4 of an inch each. And then how I laid them out, it's shockingly simple, and that they are, each one is a grid. I simplified the layout to a one grid per quilt for that reason. Um, I'm guessing everybody in the room that's a quilter has done plenty of 9 patches. You know, you do 3, 3, 3, and you sew 3 columns to each other. Um, Doing it like that. And they were laid out on a piece of fabric that was then folded up and sent. Um, I'm guessing a lot of people in this room also know fabric sticks to fabric when you're laying stuff out. It's really easy to lay out fabric on a wall that's cotton or felt or whatever. And so that was yeah.
Great, thank you. They would also like to know, how do you choose your fabrics and where do you get them from?
Um I get the fabrics from Spoonflower. They are all custom made. It's the only way I can get the colors I need. So when I have my layout on my screen, I know I need these colors. Um, Photoshop has a function, I think it's called color index, where it'll take the colors in an image and it'll list them in whatever it's called, chronological order, but color order, chromatic
Mhm.
order, I guess.
Sure.
I don't know. Um, so it'll tell you like these are the 12 greens, these are the 12 reds. And then I just sit down on my computer and I make my own textiles. I collect patterns that become the surfaces on them. So, you know, Victorian wallpaper and doodles and stripes and polka dots, like all the things you see in a quilt shop. I collect those and I'll start making my own fabrics with that. Like I know I need some reds. So let's make a red with a scroll work on it. Let's make a red with stars on it. Let's make a polka dot with red, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Um, let's see. Kip says, as a professional motion designer and hobby textile artist, I love to see this approach. Has your interest in animation led to other influence for you, whether that's pursuing more digital work or ways that animation has influenced even your non-animated textile exploration?
I love that we have opposite careers and hobbies. That's awesome. Um, I don't know. I have loved animation my whole life. Like it's something that I've always been fascinated by. I used to make stop motion animation with my friends with like a camcorder, just hitting start and stop on it all the time. Um, I think in that sense, it's not so much the idea of animating, but kind of being able to find find imagery or find stories in everyday objects that are there, you know, like being able to look at things and say how does this quilt relate to pixelation is the one I've been talking about today a lot, but like finding those big picture links between things has been something that's really come from working with animation a lot, or working with digital imagery really, because digital imagery is all pixels.
Mhm.
um yeah.
And Rebecca wants to know, your work is so thoughtful. What are you working on now?
um I have been doing a lot of collaging and applique, actually. Um, Wildly different. I had a residency at the San Jose Quilt and Textile Museum where I challenged myself to not use squares, to just like drop everything I knew and do something different. And um, it's really been interesting and challenging and quite fun to look at quilting through a different technique, which is applique. So that's what I've been working on. There's some on my Instagram or on my website. There's not one in arm's reach, or I would grab one to show you. Sorry. I did not come prepared for that.
And let's see, this is a comment, not a question, but it says it's very helpful to see your whole process, especially learning about all the technical problems you identified and then solved. Thank you for sharing this work and how you got it done.
No, thank you. That's
And
awesome.
Pat would like to know, did you cut all of the squares yourself or did you entrust the cutting to a partner? And that sort of ties in to Lee's question, which is how did you feel about working with artisans to help complete your work? Is it as satisfying as doing it all yourself? And how was that process for you?
I do my cutting. Um, that the cutting and sewing is meditative for me. I think anyone in the room that quilts knows that. Like, we don't do it for the end result. We do it because we like doing it. Um, which also leads into that second question, which is working with other people. I don't know. The projects I shared today are the only ones I've had other people involved with them on. Um, and it was always entirely practical. It was never a choice made out of I don't want to do the work. It was made because the constraints of doing the work solo were just the work truly would be impossible then. They would actually have never happened. Um, so it's a little weird. It's a little weird to let go of it. It's also kind of funny to say that because I think about like the tailors in Pakistan who are some of the most talented machinists I know. They were incredibly talented. Letting go of it to their hands was probably more precision than I brought myself. So, but it still feels weird to let it go. And that's something that I have to work on when I work on big projects is accepting that, my collaborators might share the same skill as me and I have to trust them to do it. Because most of the other collaborators I worked with complemented my skills. Like Andy knows how to knit. I don't. He knows how to program a stole knit machine. I don't. Um, so we were really great collaborators as peers, whereas like working with the tailors, I'm like, but I can do this. So it takes a different headspace and it's one that's a little frustrating, but
Mhm.
I'm glad I did it. I'm really glad they worked on it.
Mhm. And this one I think might be from your sister, from Amy. She says, "Love your shirt, Greg. Did you design it?"
Yes, Amy, I did.
Let's see. And Michelle is wondering, were you able to share the finished piece with the tailors in Pakistan, and what was their reaction?
Yes, I did share it with them. I only heard back from Amar, who owns the factory. And he just sent tons of delight and joy back. Um, yeah, so that was really cool.
That's great.
And
Uh, one question I had was about your light sources in all of your work, not just the animated pieces. The lighting is really seems to be a key part of it, and it's one of the things that I love so much about them. So, how do you think about light in your work? How do you approach that?
um, so the pieces I showed today were pieces where I took the photos myself, or I took the films myself. Um, and in those, I have to admit, the lighting was somewhat accidental. It was also, I say that, I was also selecting from different things I'd taken. So I was finding the right lighting, but I wasn't planning the right lighting. And the other pieces in the rest of my work, it's working with found imagery. And I've learned just through trial and error lots of contrast. Side light makes really intense, beautiful shadows and highlights on bodies so that it becomes really easy to pixelate them in quilt. If the light's coming straight on, it washes out your features. Just recently, Photoshop has created a tool where you can put a photograph in Photoshop and move the light source, and it will actually change where the shadows and highlights and the entire piece are. Totally insane. I can't even comprehend how it would figure this out. Um, but it's actually enabled me to take a photo that I loved but couldn't use because the lighting was just meh, and shift the light to the side so I got really beautiful highlights on the person. So yeah, I think trial and error and just really aiming for over dramatic lighting because it's all going to be muddied up a little bit in the pixelating. So
Sort of switching gears a little bit, you mentioned that you applied for grant funding for some of these projects, and also that you did a couple of artists in residencies. Do you have any advice or words of wisdom for artists who are applying to these types of opportunities? Any tips to share?
yeah, every time I've gotten a residency, I've asked them why they selected me. And they've always said you came in challenging yourself. You came in saying, I know how to make these quilts. I want to try animating. I know how to do one thing. I want to turn that towards something else and see what else I can do. Um, and so what I've just kind of absorbed from people is that they want to see artists grow. So if you apply for a residency and you say, I do this and I'm just going to do more of this, they're not as interested.
Mm.
Um, I assume something similar with grants. I don't know because the granting people have never told me. They're not as accessible. You know, when you're in a museum talking to the staff, you can actually ask all those questions. Um, but I think grant writing is the same. Position yourself as an expert on what you're an expert at. Tell the story of how you are good at something and position yourself as I want to be better at whatever this other thing is. And how do those two things relate? What are the lessons I can pull from my skill set that I can apply to what you're going to give, what you're going to fund? Um, that's what I found. I think, of course, read every single word the grant writing body has written because they might not want that. They might want someone that's going to make them look good in the end. They might, you know, they don't might not want to risk failure. They might want someone that's a guaranteed success because it looks good for them. They might be really interested in not how this helps your work, but how does this help your community that you're in? And then, you know, lots of grants tend to focus on the communities in which they're located. And so read everything they wrote and look at former winners of the grants, recipients of the grants, and see what they did and how it links to what the grant writing body is doing. It's hard. Also, I've gotten a few grants. I can't even tell you how many rejections I've gotten. It's a numbers game. You have to just apply to, you know, hundreds of grants to get several. It's hard. And you become better at understanding your work by writing about your work. So
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great advice. Thank you.
yeah.
I think we have time for just one more quick question, and I think this would be a good one to end on. What is your favorite part of the process, and what is maybe your least favorite part?
Um, the least favorite part is easy. It's sewing the binding and then the hanging channels on the back. So I don't know why that just bothers me as much as it does, but I hate it. Um, um, I think my favorite part, there's two. One is I genuinely love the meditative act of sewing, repetitive sewing. You know, it's a different mind space. It's a meditation, and I find that really healthy. Um, But I also love sitting there kind of going through all the possibilities with the layout of sitting at Photoshop and saying, what happens if I turn it 10 degrees and I pixelate it at this angle? Or what happens, where you're actually doing the creative work and you're seeing all the possibilities and selecting the best one. That to me is, yeah, that's really fun as well.
All right, well, I think we are just about out of time for today.
Okay.
Greg, thank you so much for being here. It has just been such a delight to
Oh
listen to
my
your
gosh, thank
today.
you all. This has been awesome. I'm just so, thank you. I feel so great knowing that everyone's here, and I can't wait to read all these comments.
Thank you to everyone in the audience for watching. We'll be back again next week, same time, same place for Interplay, Limitless Connections, presented by the Surface Design Association. And as always, you can find all the details and our archive of over 200 recordings at SAQA.com/textile talks. If you enjoy Textile Talks, we would love it if you would tell a friend, post about us on social media, or consider supporting us financially with a donation at SAQA.com/TT support. I hope you all have a fantastic Wednesday, and we will see you next week. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, everyone.